Thank you very much. I understand you guys are heading towards a few more weeks before final reviews. I hope we can get some inspiration here and make your time tonight worthwhile. So thank you for having me and thank you for coming. I want to say personally quickly, thank you to Eric for inviting me. It turns out I know a handful of people teaching here already, which is fantastic. Eric is a very old friend from my days at Berkeley as a student, and it's a pleasure to see him again. But that introduction was very sweet and actually very illuminating, so thank you. I'm going to try to live up to that introduction tonight. I tried to shorten the lecture, given that we probably need to do this in an hour and 20 minutes maximum. But given what Eric had just laid out in the introduction, I'm glad I didn't shorten it as much as I intended to, because I would like to try to show that what he's describing is a sincere goal. During the last decade, I've been teaching at Columbia. It's actually 15 years. Prior to that, I was teaching at Rice in Houston. I taught at Berkeley for a number of years prior to that and was also a student at Berkeley. Over that period of time, working in different cities, different constituencies, different faculties, with different colleagues, there has been a broad shift in both the urbanism of where I work, the faculties I work with, transformations in ideas, history, theory, methods of practicing, not to mention just a tremendous run-up in ubiquitous computing, communications, and questions about energy. For those running the AV, do I need to stand here, correct? Okay. So, and this will work? Okay, thank you. So what I'd like to do tonight is to try to show an overview. I'm going to show you 4 projects, 2 housing projects, 2 architectural projects, 4 projects total, and a span of work that covers about 14 years, and try to discuss big changes in those 14 years and questions that I think at some level are quite a challenge to architecture, to design, to practice, but also to say that we're at a moment where I believe there are huge opportunities in the way things are being organized, even though they at times seem quite daunting. And I would like to argue by the end of the lecture that we're at a moment where our ability to influence the way things are being done in the world is not only needed, but I think we're at a moment where things could open up in new ways, and we have the ability to engage in very large urban questions while remaining architectural. And I think we have a moment where we will possibly be more effective in big questions than we have been in the last 20 or 30 years. Over the last 7 years at Columbia, I've worked consistently on a project that Eric just mentioned. It's called the Columbia Conference on Architecture, Engineering, and Materials. And it is a conflation of 4, at this point in time, it's 4 conferences, produced 4 books. We see the titles there. We took on questions of glass, concrete, metals, and then finally polymers about 3 years ago, and we are ongoing. But that set of conferences and books was designed around a kind of contemporary question of what is material today in architectural construction and design, but more so, what is going on with the relationships between economics, finance, material science, engineering, architecture, and ultimately design. Looking at these kind of questions today, I want to try to make a preamble here about being related to something that on one hand is an antique part of architecture, engineering, and materials, but on the other hand, try to frame it in a constellation of questions that relate it to everything from economics to governmental policy to housing and ultimately to the type of design that we're doing at a table and how we work with different constituencies and people and parts of communities where we weave things together. These things show up in odd ways. This is intended to be both humorous and serious as a beginning. This image of then Senator Barack Obama running for president back in 2008. Obama standing on a stair in a high-end loft. The owner is looking at him. George Soros is right there under the railing. Do I have a pointer on this? No. George Soros standing there looking under the railing. He's a fundraiser helping Obama run for president. But what isn't really known in this situation is that he's standing on a stair designed by the engineer Guy Nordenson. Nordenson designed the stair cantilevered in stainless steel, aluminum, cables, laminated glass, and finally pushed through in his office a level of finite element analysis, the structural analysis of making this stair operate with glass as a structural member. Nordenson Guy had a major role in a series of conferences that we organized at Columbia over this 7 years. And one of the issues that we were looking at was the relationships between very sophisticated forms of engineering and computation and the way these, on one hand, were enabling new modes of design, such as that elaborate stairway, but also the degree to which through the capitalization, the funding, and the different strata of economics within which they occur, that they were relatively held in a tight province where they don't drift into the wider architectural landscape. The article that is from, that is New York Magazine. If you don't know the magazine, it's a kind of snarky commentary on what's going on in New York at the moment. The article just was that younger fundraisers, younger people who wanted to contribute to the presidential campaign could not then afford Hillary Clinton, who required much bigger contributions to get that close. Obama was considered a bargain, also a great speaker and a promising young person, but the article kind of took this deeply cynical analysis of the campaign and, of course, made no mention of the stair or the loft that he's in. Now, the stair, super engineered, very expensive, very refined, but also ultimately acting as a kind of traditional stair, meaning it's how you get from downstairs to upstairs, and in this case, it's acting as a theater for a promising politician to give a speech to influential people. Amazing that the photographer caught it and that they chose to be in that moment, but I think what happens there is a tremendously sophisticated piece of design ends up not at all part of the discourse, and of course maybe it shouldn't be in the context of an article about fundraising. But I think another side of the things that I've often worked on shows up in the picture in the lower right. This is work, photographs from the 5th Ward in Houston, Texas, when I was teaching at Rice. The photographs are by Darren Neblett, a photojournalist in Houston and an old friend. But Darren was working with me to, as we were developing some ideas around housing for a neighborhood on the northeast corner of Houston. The pictures were intended to show home life in the 5th Ward through a kind of photojournalism. But the amazing thing about some of the pictures was what they capture in the other regard. In this case, a woman making a gift by hand, embroidery, needlepoint, wearing a shirt with the Shell Oil Company logo on it. The major kind of oil, carbon industry of the globe, of which the 5th Ward is immediately adjacent to. It's right on the northeast corner of downtown Houston, a neighborhood that made $7,700 a year per household back in 1998. Extremely low number next to one of the wealthiest industries on the planet. Of course, those things are common and discussed frequently today, although not really solved. But what Darren captured in the picture was that mixture between something made exquisitely by hand versus one of the largest industries on the planet and a kind of deterritorialization machine. In the context of Guy Nordenson's stair, the question starts to be, and I think has persisted for a long time, is how does architecture and its goals that are often highly aspirational in terms of material engineering, social issues, humanitarian issues, questions of empathy, how do all of those questions as we manifest them in our relatively discrete and small practices come out into the world and through what pathways? Certainly many of us end up frustrated when we're in practice about what we believe is possible versus what actually happens. Young man with a poster shop in the 5th Ward back in 1998, sophisticated computers, sophisticated software, a kind of ramshackle house. The difference between the commodity of the computer and the software versus the commodity and the actions and the tectonics of the house. I had spent 6 years in Houston, fascinating city with this kind of storybook skyline, half of it by Philip Johnson, but also a city that at grade really looks like this. And we all know those kind of cities. We're quite numb to them. We're quite used to them. We often think it's hopeless to try to change them. We move to San Francisco if we can, but like you guys did, or you're from here. I actually moved from here to there. People thought I was nuts, but there was a big recession in '92 and I needed a job, and it was a great job. But of course, this kind of city, 36 days a year, 36 years per day spent commuting, aggregate population. You know, the American kind of suburban sprawl par excellence, huge amount of material, tremendous wealth buried in the infrastructure, massive systems of efficiency coupled with massive systems of inefficiency. If you look at this historically, this 1972 photograph by Lee Friedlander, the collection at the Museum of Modern Art, New York. It's called Albuquerque, New Mexico, 1972. Friedlander photographing a city that's a little like Houston, but in this case far more petite and discrete in terms of its logics. You still have the street, you have the house, you have the little unité d'habitation, you have the physics of the tires and the inflated tire of the car. I'm really wishing I had a pointer. cast iron of the water supply, the catenary curves of the telephone wires for a dog, for some reason, who knows to wait. But most of these cities that we think of over the last 20 and 30 years, one of the big issues that we saw in architectural discourse, less today, I think, than 10, 15, 20 years ago, was a sense that these cities are, in some sense, compelling, but also overwhelming for architecture. They put the architect in a difficult position in the sense that what we do, as it is manifest within these larger situations and circumstances, that we struggle to actually be effective against a machine that is far more prevalent, if not predatory in certain ways, over the larger orchestrations of space at the urban level. A whole discourse, of course, emerged around these kind of questions. Andre Corbeau, Looking for a City in America. You probably don't know the book, but it was very influential in the early 90s. Mike Davis, the book City of Quartz, which written by somebody who actually did not complete college, as I know, but would, I think, largely be understood as a sociologist, an analysis of Los Angeles back in the early 1990s, but largely looking at ways in which these cities produced a kind of no man's land. What I've been trying to do over these years, and in large part through a kind of itinerary of experiences from San Francisco to Houston to New York and other cities in between, is have tried to and remain within the province of architecture, but try to take in these questions at the larger scale in every way. It's certainly not something that I do alone. It's, I would argue, the last 30 or 40 years, there's been a lot of architects have tried to look at the big urban questions and remain architectural. But the question today, I think, is different, and how we need to think about it, I think, is perhaps different. The conferences, the first one on glass, was very preoccupied with glass buildings, of course. There was a building behind the whole book and the whole series of discussions about glass by Kazuyo Sejima and Sana. The building is the Toledo Glass Pavilion. What people might not realize about the Toledo Glass Pavilion is that before it was a formal design, Sejima likes to say she felt sorry in a way that people thought she was an heir to Mies van der Rohe, and that they didn't understand what was really occurring in her work, that reflection was at some level superficial and difficult to bear on her part. But what people don't know about the work is that what preceded the design, in fact, was a thermal analysis by the environmental engineer Matthias Schuller in Stuttgart and Munich. This is a computational fluid dynamics study showing the plenum space. The blue is the 30 inches between inside and outside that you are seeing in this photograph. The work on the thermal aspects of the building preceded the work on the actual plan and realization of the building as something in glass, steel, concrete. Similarly, work on structure by Guy Nordenson, analyzing the deflection of beams. That is a 3D model of the roof structure. That is the stress and strain in the beams. The spans of every roof beam are different in this building because of the column structure placement. Each beam has a different deflection that is counteracted by a different camber in the beam next to it. So where you see the red, beams are pushing upwards. Where you see the yellow, they're pushing downwards. We could go into this in great detail, but if you look at the work by Sana during that period of time, you, on one hand, see the evidence of the building as a visual instrument. It's a glass building. It's about transparency. It looks like Mies van der Rohe at some level. It is part of a 20th century tradition of optics, visuality, seeing. But on the other hand, as a contemporary building realized in the middle 2000s, it was also a building that was pushed through a level of computational analysis in structure, in energy, in physics, that pushes it into a completely different experiential level architecturally. Frank Gehry's IAC building was part of the first conference. What many people don't know about the IAC building is that this is not a building made of cast curved glass. The glass in the IAC building, and these are IGUs, 2 layers of glass, arrived on site flat and was actually cold bent into place. So this is an image of the glass being installed. The men are actually in a process of partially setting it up and then eventually bending it into the space to produce the curvature. Looking at these kind of things is, I think, a question that comes to mind is, on one hand, how do we operate as designers? When do we get access to this type of materials knowledge? When do we get access to this type of technology? Increasingly, it's embedded in relatively low-cost software where you can do these things in a classroom with relatively little training. But at the same time, when do we begin to conceptually try to imagine the bridge between something produced in some way that's complex economically, materially, technically, and what it produces in the world, and where that lodges itself as either an expensive, high-end piece of architecture, a $100 million building on the West Side Highway in Manhattan, or a low-income house in Houston. Where is the strata, and how do these things start to come together, if they do at all? The general assumption is they don't, and I'll try to say that they're not coming together like they should. Polymers, this is Norse sails outside of Las Vegas, carbon fiber lace sails for America's Cup races. Francois Roche, based in Paris, a polymer tent. This is, I believe, in Malaysia, where this was, in India, I believe, a polymer tent that is lifted by an ox. Francois, looking at the contemporary molecular aspects of the polymer versus one of the most ancient forms of humans harnessing power larger than themselves to dilate the structure and produce an architectural interior. Now, if you look into history, you would assume that the 20th century, whatever part of it you're looking at, would have a deep relationship to architectural technologies, and of course it generally does. But the differences are worth looking at very closely and reviewing now versus 1970 versus 1940 versus 1930, different places, different times, different people. In Kenneth Frampton's Critical History of Modern Architecture, actually I take that back, that's a different reference. In Frederick Schwartz's book on the Werkbund from about 10 years ago, he's discussing Peter Behrens' designs for AEG, the large industrial concern in Germany from 1850s up until today. AEG designing everything from turbines for power plants to fans for your home. Behrens, according to Frampton and Schwartz, was not concerned with how the fan worked, but with how it looked. And if you go down that history, it's not to say that how it looks is trivial. It, in fact, becomes philosophically quite complex. But the argument is that somebody like Peter Behrens, when he was designing machines for AEG, not buildings, but machines, was interested in giving them what Schwartz calls style, and style as a quality that supersedes the commodity role. He wasn't interested in the electric motor. He wasn't interested in the copper wires. He wasn't interested in the brass versus the steel, other than in the optic quality, the argument goes. Now, today, buildings have machines in them galore. This on the left is a contemporary machine. It's called an HRV. It will exchange the air in your building and replace it with air from outside. But these kind of machines have nothing to do with architectural scrutiny. We buy them, we use them, we generally install them in a place where they won't vibrate or make noise for the other rooms, but they, of course, are what make buildings possible. The Toledo Glass Pavilion has a whole slew of those in the basement to exchange the air so the building doesn't condensate. Now, when you come to these kind of scenarios today, and I don't mean to be speaking to an audience who doesn't know this already at some level, of course, you're young, the world is modern, you will do things in a way that you wouldn't have to fight your way to this point. You might just start at this point because you're young and you're right there already. But historically, the way in which architects gather this information and use it has been a bit of a different path. The architecture comes up with a concept, a complex idea for a city, for a site, for a client, for a goal, and then after that starts to be presented and organized and under control, you begin to hire what are called consultants, people that help you solve all of these problems. And if they're great consultants, they help you refine your project, of course. But I think what's going on today in so many of the buildings that we were looking at in the conference and series of books were that the quote-unquote consultants were there on day one, and that what was going on conceptually in the project almost required the quote-unquote consultant to help you understand something thermal, material, chemical even, before you would have the right design aspect. Now, I'll come back to that, but my way into this was really not through materials, even though I was raised in a generation that valued tectonics and construction by various influential theorists and historians, such as Kenneth Frampton. But I came at it really through housing. And this is kind of tying into Eric's introduction. During the late 1990s, I was working in the Fifth Ward in Houston, Texas, when houses like this were being built as public housing. And as a child who grew up in Washington, D.C., down the street from some public housing, this is a long way from what public housing looked like historically in the United States. And I was teaching public housing issues at Rice in a relatively naive way as a beginner. But what was happening in the 1990s was a quasi-privatization of what we had historically seen as public housing, affordable housing, low-income housing, different titles for different stratas of housing and its relationship to support. But what was going on at that point in time, and particularly under the Clinton administration and the emergence of new urbanism, was that low-income housing was increasingly expected to be developed through relatively straightforward market techniques of housing, but it would be subsidized or underwritten with various forms of tax credits or indirect support to affect the affordability. In Houston, in the middle 90s, the projection was that the city was scheduled to receive as many as 25,000 down payment vouchers in the form of credits towards the purchase of housing for lower income households that could measure up to the affordability issues of then carrying a mortgage. That was broad news. It was in the wake of Hope 6, the Quality Work and Housing Responsibility Act, and various transformations at the federal level where the government, since the 1980s, was increasingly trying to find ways to underwrite or to subsidize the production of housing through a quasi-market rather than to directly build it. In the case of this house, that house was selling for about $52,000 to a low-income housing development agency run by the Reverend Harvey Clemens, who was the pastor of the Pleasant Hill Baptist Church right nearby. And the family that would buy it would receive a $9,500 voucher as the down payment, and then they would then carry a mortgage for 30 years to become the owners of a house rather than the renters of an apartment. Now, looking at that, and it's a complex thing, and I'll go into it in more detail, but I'm trying to juxtapose a kind of shift in what's occurring in the engineering strata and the analytical strata over a 15 and 20-year period, and simultaneously what's happening in a development strata of housing and architecture as it relates to very overt and historically important social and cultural purpose. This kind of diagram is what really was getting debated in the broader architectural community. You're seeing, this is a public housing block in New Haven, Connecticut. You're seeing on the right-hand photograph the existing two-story brick building getting a new pitch roof. What you're also seeing next to it is the production of a new building altogether under what was called Hope 6. Public housing in 1994 was beginning to get subsidies to renovate historic public housing, but only if it would simultaneously reduce the unit of existing public housing units and build in their place an equal or larger amount of higher income, middle income housing to create what was called mixed income communities. The debates in the architectural world tended to center around things such as vernacular, new urbanism, commodity developed housing practices, postmodernism versus something like modernism, engineering, structure. There's a divide. You didn't often hear an analysis in the architectural community of what was really going on at the policy level of within which this was occurring. In the 1990s, you began to see this line is hard units of public housing. This line is low-income housing tax credits. This line is HUD-eligible rental assistance, such as Section 8. What was occurring over that period of time, very didactically in the 90s, was a drive to find ways to subsidize the purchase of housing by households who could afford a mortgage and had realizable income to carry a mortgage to term. What was also going on was the renovation questions of existing public housing and a desire to break down the monolithic income qualities of public housing blocks by reducing them in terms of hard count and replacing them with mixed income. The Clinton administration brought down about 60,000 units of public housing, replaced them with higher income housing, but over that 15-year period, about 300,000 units of public housing were taken down and replaced with those other economic vehicles to incentivize other forms of lower income, affordable, or public housing. Now, what that produces is, I won't spend time on this today, but the Quality Housing Work and Responsibility Act of 1998 was one of the major vehicles by which this occurred. It was an act that was designed to help deconcentrate poverty in public housing in the U.S. It occurred in the same Congress as the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, which brought down Glass-Steagall and the separation of investment and commercial banking. It's a long story. But during that period of time, while architects were debating new urbanism versus modernism, aluminum windows versus steel windows, a whole set of architectural concerns, there was a massive transformation of the political and economic and ultimately financial structures of how lower income housing was being developed in the country. I, at that point in time, got very interested in trying to read the actual laws and policies and spent a great deal of time doing that. I applied for grants to write a book about it, was turned down. I ended up sort of writing a half book anyway and reapplying for the grant to invite a group of architects to examine the architectural implications of these changes at every level, economically, structurally, policy, engineering, materials. If we could bring a group of architects together with a much finer grain level and a dossier on what was actually occurring within the economic strata and the political strata, and then to respond in a new way, knowing much more about it. So 16 architects ended up being invited to design a house for the Fifth Ward Community Redevelopment Corporation, who had been building the house I showed you a moment ago, very successfully, helping a lot of families get settled and become property owners. But they were interested in exploring it, and they also felt as if it needed to be explored. The architects were given a dossier of information, many pieces of information, but 3 large pieces of data were right at the front of everything. And they began to work. Si-Chung Leong and Judy Chung producing a house that could be assembled, taken apart, and reconfigured over time. Lindy Roy, again, this is 1998, designing a house that actually used the street light to gather light, trying to covet the infrastructure. Her house is a type of lampshade that's capturing the street light. Flow-through ventilation, prefabricated, a whole set of innovative ideas, but a kind of humorous and also serious idea at the same time of what if the house could borrow the qualities of the city-owned infrastructure and you could tap into that type of wealth. So a kind of caricature of that, the lower image showing that. Mark Womble, Don Finley, known as Interloop Architects. I'll explain this in depth in a moment. And then my own participation in a house called Glass House at 2 Degrees, which I'll also explain in a moment. Now, I had mentioned 3 pieces of data. Houston was a potential recipient of large assistance. Houston in the middle 1990s had a very depressed downtown sector. It's called the Inner Loop. Houston is a classic case of all of the wealth moving to the edges and the production of a sprawling city where the real work is on the perimeter. The crash in the oil markets in the 1980s left Houston's center very devastated. By the middle 90s, it had still not recovered. Today, it's largely recovered with quite a bit of housing once the property values dropped low enough to be redeveloped as housing. But at that point in time, the way in which a city, and still today, would receive aid at the federal level for something like housing was in the form of what are called block grants. And it means that monies that are at the federal level, $100 million, $1 billion, whatever the number is, they are broken down and redistributed to either states or to different levels of municipal government in the form of what are called block grants. The intention is to break down the monolithic structure of the government subsidy and to mobilize it through more local and theoretically more capable agencies. So instead of the federal government telling Houston what to do, it moves some money to Houston, and then Houston determines what to do. Teaching at Berkeley, Jennifer Walk and Michael Deere, the dean and a professor of city planning, formerly geographers at USC. In their early research, they argued that by doing that, moving money from the federal level to the local level sounds like a great idea, But in the case of lower income constituencies, it means that you're moving the money to a place that doesn't necessarily have the infrastructure to actually best use the money. You give the liberty of determining the future of the money, but you also lack the tools. So the argument that was occurring in Houston at that point in time was that 25,000 vouchers worth about $225 million was going to create a land rush in central Houston where property was cheap, and you would get a new ghetto of low-income or poverty housing built upon land that was historically devalued by the deurbanization of Houston and the crash in the oil markets. So there was a huge political backlash that these grants needed to be broken apart. We should somehow thwart them from coming into the center of Houston. What happened over the period of 10 years that I was involved in this work, they couldn't identify 25,000 households because they didn't have the apparatus to find the people who could qualify. So in other words, the Jennifer Walk and Michael Deere argument kind of proved true in the sense that the money was there, but the instruments to actually locate the people who could use it were not. That is not to say there weren't sincere and profound attempts to do so. So in that period of time, what sprung up was a handful of quite effective low-income housing developers, nonprofits. What also sprung up was a set of specialists within banks who were intended to find constituents and help identify people that could benefit from this, and then a set of interlocutors who would bring it together. There were literally, during that period of time in the 90s, tents assembled in empty parking lots to have housing fairs where you would have a bank, a developer, and then people that would bring you together and say, you know, you could have a house instead of renting an apartment. In that context, the $225 million was often seen as a big number. In the context of Houston's budget in 1998, everybody worked with numbers then, and we still often do, of course, within schools of architecture. The city had commissioned about $1.4 billion in freeways. One 8-mile stretch of freeway cost $181 million that year. So $225 million as a large municipal number is, of course, tiny. Freeways produce wealth, housing produces wealth differently, so it's, of course, not a fair comparison. But you keep going and trying to contextualize the value of that money as an aggregate sum versus a disaggregate sum. The drive at the federal level was, and still often is to help people buy or to subsidize rent rather than to actually build buildings. If you bought in a house in the 5th Ward for $52,000 with a $9,500 voucher, your mortgage of about $40,000 would be about $350 a month. At 9 years, which is the average tenancy for Texas housing, you would have spent $36,000 to accrue about $4,000 in equity. In the amortization of loans in the United States and elsewhere, you don't accrue equity until you were well into the terms of the loans. And of course, in the American housing market, many, many people, in fact, don't keep housing to any long term, and they, in fact, never accrue the equity because of the amortization process. And then finally, the question of architects. This is the big question, and this goes all the way back to the beginning. And I'll try to wrap up a theory here and just present work. When you build housing in this manner, and I'm going to flip all the way back to this image, like that. There's no architect. There's no engineer. 347 houses built on the outskirts of Houston as a development that same year, $14 million worth of construction. The architectural fee was $4,550. $12 per house, 0.0028%. Not 15, not Frank Gehry 50, 0.0028%. There is no architectural fee in speculative market-based housing in most places in the world, especially when it's low density. Now, that's not to say a 5-story building in San Jose or Cupertino or Santa Monica doesn't have a significant architectural component to it. It does. But in places like Toledo, Cincinnati, Houston, Dallas, Austin, where affordable housing is increasingly being developed like every other type of housing, 2 stories tall, 1 stories tall, it doesn't involve professional services. So our role in this question is increasingly diminished. Now, there are great architects of housing in San Francisco, Dan Solomon, countless others. There are people that do great housing. I don't mean to diminish that at all. But in the broader economic envelope of American housing, it's definitely an issue. So as a side effect of the transformation in the 1990s, while people were discussing new urbanism, Andreas Duany, Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk, interesting, powerful discourse on that side of the table, there was also another equation where we essentially were being taken out of the equation. Now, I say that at this point because that was all in the dossier as a challenge to the architects. Mark Womble, Don Finley. Mark was a professor at Rice. Don was a new junior faculty member at Rice. Mark had gone to Harvard and then worked with Peter Eisenman for 6 years and came south to kind of open up an independent office and teach. They proposed taking the $225 million and using it to produce the little metal clip. Right here. It's called the clip house. This little clip would bind together the lifesavers or the candy, the other parts that would be produced by other entities. So Coca-Cola might make something for your refrigerator. Igloo might make a refrigerator. You can go down the line. Microsoft would make your computer pod. But the clip house was intended to collectivize, and this was a prompt from the whole show, collectivize the $225 million, use it to capitalize a sophisticated company that could produce a sophisticated entity through research and development, and then try to tap into other high-end, capital-driven, R&D-driven, branding-driven companies that could fill out the other part of it. So instead of producing the entire house, they just wanted to produce the clip. My project was called Glass House at 2 Degrees. I was trying to implicate early modernism back into this question, but doing it at the scale of the house. But it was made of off-the-shelf, 20-foot long, 9-foot tall Fleetwood sliding glass doors that were coupled together in a little folded diaphragm that would produce the shear stiffness in the building, but would be coupled together with just about 6 custom parts. So it was at some level saying, let's take the commodity processes that already exist, let's use a moderated form of hand assembly and come up with a new project that is somehow a commentary on the past. And I could explain that at length, but I really want to talk about the whole point of housing at that point in time. So putting those two things together, something, conferences, books, research done in 2007 to 2014 versus housing transformations in 1996 to about 1998 based on transformations all the way back to the 80s. A bit odd, but it's to say that something that is occurring at the legal, financial, governmental, socio-political level versus something that's occurring squarely within the province of what we call our careers, architecture, engineering, materials, collaboration. How do all those things come together? And of course, they always have come together in our professional practice, but the tables are always moving beneath us. There's the spec house that started the conversation. On the lower left is elderly housing in the same development sector, the Fifth Ward Redevelopment Corporation. Part of the Fifth Ward in decay, some vernacular houses from the 1905s falling apart, and then people doing very sophisticated things, of course, inside architecture that's really not at all up to date with the way the things they do. Making something by hand beautiful, using software, computers. We all live like this. We're all living in substandard architectures while we try to make something else. Now, to jump way ahead, 1990s, Clinton administration, Henry Cisneros, former mayor of San Antonio, becomes director of HUD. Extremely influential mayor, becomes head of a hugely influential organization, Housing and Urban Development. Cabinet level post, of course. Links that to New Urbanism. The Hope 6 legal documents literally tied New Urbanism to it as the architecture of Hope 6, the transformation of public housing, a didactic relationship between design, urban planning, and social policy. At the same level, in that period of time as that is occurring, we lead up to 2001, 9/11. You lead up to 2008, the giant crash in the markets, largely started in the United States and then ricochets globally. 9/11 triggered, among other things, a dramatic decrease in interest rates for housing. Part of the way they kept the economy from going into shock after 9/11 was to lower interest rates and to try to incentivize investment. I think there were 17 interest rates cuts after 9/11. What occurs in that period of time, a very short period of time, We go from critiquing public housing, we go from quasi-marketizing public housing, we change how it's developed, designed, we, in some sense, remove ourselves from it. And then after 9/11, we end up with a massive run-up in housing valuation that, of course, leads to a liquidity crisis and other problems in 2008. In the wake of that, the Museum of Modern Art, in an attempt to respond to the financial crisis and the housing crisis, but also as part of a longer-term agenda to allow the museum to speak to contemporary issues, Barry Bergdahl, chief curator at MoMA, ran the Rising Currents project, the Foreclosed project, and now the project on uneven development, but an attempt to bring a museum, which is usually showing work that's already done, into the field of actually developing work in response to the future. They put together something called Foreclosed, Rehousing the American Dream. Barry Bergdahl, Reinhold Martin was the co-curator of that, based at the Buell Center at Columbia. But the issue for MoMA was to try to bring a group of architects together who would then form subsequent teams that would try to look at the redevelopment of housing after the economic crisis of '08, but also in response to the longer-term development of the suburbs as an architectural and urban model. They interviewed architects. I was asked to participate. I put a team together with my wife, Eunjung Song, and partner, and then that team subsequently included engineers Zachary Kostura, Eric Olson, and Matthias Schuller from TransSolar, who had also been the engineers for the Toledo Glass Pavilion, Mark Malikshahi at Burrow Happold, who was also on the Toledo Glass Pavilion, Roseanne Haggerty, a founder of one of the most effective low-income housing development teams in New York, and then a group of colleagues from public housing, Peter Hance at Bridgeport, Brian Laughlin at Jersey City, Jesse Keenan from Columbia University's Center for Urban Real Estate. And then finally, West State helped us with some urban planning issues. That's an exhibition at the MoMA that resulted. Over a period of 4 months, we were given a relatively modest stipend and a space at PS1. They wanted us to actually work publicly so that while we were doing architecture, we were on exhibit. People come in, and the argument was to demystify how architects work and allow the public to come in and see what you do, not just the results. And it was quite fun. But that's us working in our space. There's Barry Bergdahl giving us a crit. We're looking at him, like, really? But then getting reviews. That's Sean Donovan, then Secretary of HUD, coming by one afternoon to see what we're doing with his Secret Service. Sean Donovan had been director of New York City Department of Housing and Preservation, but also went to the GSD and is trained as an architect, which is quite amazing. But there we are presenting and having to, in some sense, produce the project, but also publicly discuss it frequently. And part of the challenge that MoMA was really interested in was, is there a new way to talk about the complexity of what's going on in a way that precedes the solution? And it was a beautiful project to be part of, and immensely stressful from day 1 to day 120 to have no project, but to have the date marked when you have to finish it and hang it, and wait for an audience to come. It was stressful, but everybody got through it, and it was fun in the end. This situation was unique. In the 90s in Houston, inventing my own research, running my own show, curating it, participating in it, knowing the preacher who founded the Low-Income Housing Development Agency. It's all very intimate at some level, and I was there constantly in the neighborhood working with people. This was a much larger structural question about working more in the abstract with big economic pictures and with cities that you don't know so well. In our case, it was a suburb of Tampa called Temple Terrace. But what the MoMA was hoping for versus what the Buell Center was hoping for were, in a sense, two very different things. Aside from asking us to work publicly, MoMA wanted the evidence of a project. So aside from all of the ways in which you get to the project, they wanted the project. And they were quite explicit about it. They have Mies van der Rohe's archives. They want the evidence of creation. The Buell Center had written a document, largely authored by Reinhold Martin, history theory professor at Columbia, that was on the lack of the word public in all of the discourse around the financial crisis, and a long-standing project of what has happened to public space in the United States and other advanced economies, what has happened to public discourse, what has happened to the ability to talk about public monies as something to be shared by all, as opposed to market economies and every other system which divides it up according to different capitalist procedures. But the Buell hypothesis and Reinhold Martin were pushing very hard to reinvent public housing. So I was invited thinking Michael will reinvent public housing. He's interested in this. And I actually felt that public housing couldn't be reinvented, and there were a lot of reasons why it shouldn't be reinvented, at least as we know it. And that's, of course, for a class and a PhD dissertation to really figure out what that would mean for people and government. But the gist of it was that the quasi-privatization of lower-income housing and different ways of disaggregating large sums of federal monies was at a political threshold where we don't have a political ethos any longer that would produce the will to actually rebuild something called public housing, even if you wanted to rebuild it. It, of course, is a very troubled history. So in that realm, we were trying to, I was often in the situation in those photographs of, like you are at a final review, explaining yourself and trying to convince people you know what you're doing and you're doing the right thing, and of course wanting to hear criticism too. But that scenario was something that was difficult, but I think also in the end kind of beautiful. To put it in context a little more specifically, during the financial crisis, the New York Times was very sophisticated with a lot of graphics. This one little graph is quite simple and elegant. It shows the run-up of mortgage debt in the United States from the 1920s to the 2000s. And on the far left, you see Americans increasingly carrying very large mortgages, not to mention home equity loans, credit cards, and car loans. That pile of debt built up over time, and of course, because of other reasons, became difficult to repay and to net yet alone value, and much more to that, of course. But in that context, one of the things the Buell hypothesis was looking at was that the federal government rushed in to re-securitize the banks more so than re-securitizing individual homeowners. And what Reinhold and others were pushing for was, could the MoMA mount an argument on that very immense stage that it controls in terms of media attention that would argue that there were other ways to do this, either architecturally or at ownership levels. So we and the other teams, one team was led by Moss, Hilary Sample, and Michael Meredith. Team was led by Work AC, Amal Andros and Dan Wood, Jeannie Gang, and Andrew Zago out of LA. 5 teams, each looking at different places in different cities. We were given this town called Temple Terrace. In 1929, Temple Terrace was 88 houses and the largest orange grove in the United States. There it is, largest citrus fruit development scheme. They call it a scheme in industry's history. But this was a former 25,000 acre ranch that got broken down into an orange grove, that got broken down into a real estate deal, and over time became a city. By the time we encountered Temple Terrace in 2011, 3 years after the real peak of the economic crash, 2.5 years after the peak of the economic crash, the city was 1/4 of the way into a redevelopment plan. That's the gate to the original ranch, not the city. That's when it was a ranch. This is the proposal for a new downtown, a public-private partnership. And this is the town. Temple Terrace is surrounded by the red line. It's a city of 22,000 people, about 10,400 households, 7.5 square miles, 4.5 people per acre, 2.5 people per house. Average house size was 2,500 square feet. Average income was about $48,000, and almost half of the houses were living well above 30 to 40 to 50% of income spent on housing, meaning either at risk or very far at risk. The city had very low municipal debt per capita. I think the city owed $13,000 per resident in debt that the city accrued. It actually had not borrowed much money, even though it was a city that was perpetually unable to really grow. It also had avoided bankruptcy and never quite borrowed. So in terms of this larger question of the MoMA, some of the cities that were taken on by MoMA had steep and very severe foreclosure problems, and thus foreclosed rehousing the American dream. Temple Terrace actually had very few foreclosures, but it had a high degree of households living at risk, meaning one error and you could be behind on your mortgage. Tampa was another story, and I'm going to go ahead. That's 364 foreclosures in Temple Terrace, which is a lot of foreclosures. If you went back to 1964, you would not have that kind of foreclosure ratio anywhere. That's the foreclosures in Temple Terrace, little dots. When you come across the border into Tampa, which is right here, and heading towards downtown Tampa, foreclosures rise a great deal. That's another way of modeling it. The foreclosures rise precipitously. Temple Terrace, 1/3 the size of Manhattan, 5.5 Central Parks, and what it looks like. Pretty normal, right? Looks like Orinda. No, Orinda looks better than that. Looks like Gardena. Is it Gardena, California? Gardena. So, I love the suburbs, actually. I don't live in the suburbs right now, but I don't dislike them. I think they're fascinating. Temple Terrace was a typical town, and I should say is a typical town in terms of zoning. That's retail and commercial around its perimeter, major intersections, of course. The middle is where the very low density housing is, all one stories. This is 225 acres of property that the city was set to acquire for about $80 million through a tax revenue that they had put in place in 2006. The goal was to raise the taxes minimally on the residents, buy the 225 acres from private development, turn it back over to private development at a highly subsidized price to create a new downtown that would not have much housing, but would have hotels, offices, and retail, all better for the tax base than housing, and to recreate its southwest border with Tampa. Tampa had, and this is the beginning of that, and you can read the kind of blogs. I wish they would put their money to better use, like build a wall around us to keep the thugs out. Temple Terrace, little idyllic community that never quite takes off, but tries very hard to remain that, tried to wall itself off from Tampa for 40 years. And what we ended up proposing was that it could, instead of walling itself off, which is of course problematic, that it could get involved with reconstructing its border with Tampa. And the way we came to that, and I'll describe it in some detail, was that if the Buell hypothesis and was looking for a new public housing, we weren't likely to get it. But if we could look at the larger economic analysis of the cities, and in particular the border between the two cities, we might be able to imagine a new spatialization of those two economies and something like public housing in the sense that it would be governmental monies used to recreate a social housing situation, but to do it differently. So in looking at growth, Temple Terrace had tried not to grow. It needed to grow, but it had resisted growing. Tampa had grown explosively over the last 50 and 60 years. And we ended up proposing, after a series of analyses, that Temple Terrace could grow significantly if it would analyze its relationship to Tampa, and it in fact could borrow some of Tampa's growth and use that to buffer the relationship between the two cities in a way that was very productive. So this is what Temple Terrace looks like. I mean, it's a Florida city. That's the redevelopment. That had been a shopping center. It's getting knocked down. They had two proposals for this public-private partnership. So 225 acres of land funded by the people, and two companies bid for the project. Not 10, not 20, not 90, two. And this is really what goes on in many of these places, right? So that's a religious store, I guess. It's a beautiful space, right? There we go. 2.9-mile border between the two cities. Typical kind of single-family housing, low density. It took us a long time to come to a position. We very much wanted to try to figure out how to make something more public. We also didn't want to artificially create something public that would never be realized. So like any architects / urban planners, we tried everything. mixed it with some analysis along the way. This is the original 225 acres. From left to right, we were reallocating that same acreage into different footprints and looking at what could happen. What if you fit it between houses? What if you use the setbacks? What if you use forms of public space, such as 200-foot setbacks, which are the regulation in this city, but not actually demolish what's there, just reoccupy the setback, so it is a public instrument. And then that's the 200 feet between the storefronts and the street. Of course, there's not a single person to be seen, maybe one way down there. This is the architecture of Temple Terrace. That's the roads. It's amazing this country has any wealth at all when we spend that much money to build roads to that few pieces of architecture. Often when we were stuck, we just made drawings, as you do, I'm sure. But we, exhaustively tried to analyze these things. We went through normative planning circumstances. What's the average household income? $50,943. Where does it go? Food, beverage, meat, dairy, housing, shelter, car insurance, gas. Where in that budget could you find money? But that is all analysis at the level of somebody's income and expenditures. It's accepting that those incomes are stagnant and that those expenditures are based on other people's prices, meaning the price of fuel. The breakthrough came in this public realm when the economic people that were helping, I could do a little bit of that myself from studying these things for years, but I brought in some real experts. I said, well, can somebody figure out what is the aggregate personal income of this little town in a year? So the answer came back, $714 million. So 22,000 people, $714 million. It's not a hard number to figure out. You multiply the population by the average household income. But $714 million. What is the aggregate value of the buildings in this town on the tax rolls? $1.15 billion. We then took the city's budget for police, sewers, trash, electricity, and we modeled it in Excel because it's a relatively small town. A huge amount of American cities are this size. And then we started trying to understand what would happen to all of the tax revenues if we adjusted the FAR. Very simple kind of parametric modeling. But what it led to was a hypothesis that we could argue that the city could keep the property that it had purchased and that it could create a new economic vehicle to hold the property, and that because the city had a low debt ratio at the city level, the personal household situation was more precarious than the city's situation, that it could create a new vehicle that would use its balance to underwrite a new form of housing that would be better suited to the actual needs of the constituency. So 2,500 square foot houses with 2.5 people in them. Not needed, can't be afforded, can't be heated, can't be cooled any longer. People don't make enough money to do that. Not enough job space. The houses that were foreclosed on in Temple Terrace were largely the most recent sold, the people who had the highest debt-to-income ratio, the most leverage on the mortgage, on the loan, but also people that were essentially living in houses that really didn't fit what they needed. People needed 1,500 square foot houses. They needed 800 square foot apartments. None of this existed in the historic zoning of the city. So we took that budget and called it reverse engineering Temple Terrace. And we ended up proposing, with our financial team's help, that the city would produce a real estate investment trust, which, if you don't know what those are, you'll see very quickly on Wikipedia, a relatively contemporary economic vehicle, the financial vehicle that's used to aggregate real estate in the private markets. A company will own housing in 10 different cities, all under a unified trust. But that the city could own the trust rather than a private development. And the people who own property in Temple Terrace or live in Temple Terrace would essentially have equity in the trust, which would pay revenue to them. So the property at $80 million could then be held along this border and redeveloped with new zoning that would incentivize the development of more diverse forms of housing, of the type of housing that was needed. But the real eureka moment for me was beginning to argue that if the city had a personal income of $714 million with an increased population, and in our case we proposed 10,000 new people, borrowing them from Tampa's growth, the aggregate income would go to about $1.15 billion. 30% of that would be spent per year at HUD guidelines, and a household would be considered to be stable. If you're spending more than 30% of your gross income on housing, you're considered to be at risk. In New York, everybody spends 50%, and in San Francisco, I'm sure they're spending 50 or 58%. But in the United States, the number is technically 30, and then from there you add transportation, insurance, health care, and it goes up. In the end, there's not that much left for school books and food, right? So in this case, 30% of $1.15 billion would be about $325 million per year. What would happen if you try to imagine what is purchasable architecturally when you look at the aggregate rather than the disaggregate sum? It led us to look at large buildings. The Apple Cupertino building, we realized, was the same size as Pentagon. The Mall of America is, of course, as big as both, if not larger. Buildings that are historically thought of as large are, in fact, quite small. The Centre Pompidou, the Free University in Berlin, and finally down to the Temple Terrace grocery store. Pretty small. So we got essentially trying to look at the whole city, trying to look at how much land. I was working simultaneously on all the engineering issues at Columbia. What happens when you build with all of this sophistication? The Apple Campus 2, 3.14 million square feet, is apparently costing $3 billion. Not that much per square foot when you look at the aggregate cost. Single-family houses built without architects, 0.0028%, $12 per house, all different commodity markets. How can we begin to not only redesign the building, but try to imagine redesigning the economy? So another day when we were stuck and demoralized by a bad crit from Barry Bergdahl and Reinhold Martin, we modeled the entire city. You know, it was just like school. They would come by and tell you were doing everything wrong. You would say, I don't need to listen, I'm an adult, but then you would go, well, I should listen because these are very smart people, and they have a point, or I'm not explaining myself, so I need, you know, it was fun. It was brutal and fun. Michael Meredith of Moss went nuts with it all. But we, one day, demoralized, just did a little rhino model of the entire city, then we made a physical model of the entire city. But all of that was along the way of beginning to try to simultaneously understand it, formally, materially, economically. In the end, we wanted to know the city better than the mayor did and the economists. So we ended up proposing that 225 acres would be spread across the whole border of the city and rebuild the border without taking anything down. We would add 10,000 new residents, and we would then produce an architecture in that realm. In our case, we took 14 of the 225 acres, and produced a model for what we might do as architects, which we did and presented. But the argument was that in that zone, you could re-aggregate the monies and try to find a way in which architecture, even though it's coming from highly centralized funding streams, is producing a complex, heterogeneous architecture that appeals back to the sensibilities of why people want their own house in the first place. I never would have thought this way without having gone through the work in Houston and a few other projects in between. So the publicness, we finally did something serious but also a little bit bold and maybe a little ridiculous at one point. We proposed putting new housing on top of a new city hall. And what you're seeing in blue is the new city hall. Floor number 2 in green is a new incubator office. Floor number 3 was 88 new, smaller, 1,500 square foot courtyard houses with 1,200 square foot interiors, all of which were layered and developed with something Trans-Solar developed with. It's called a cool core. Only one part of the building was fully air conditioned. That's the dwelling. This is the dwelling. That's dwelling, incubator office, new city hall. And the living spaces were heated and cooled in layers. This is a sketch from Matthias Schuller about layers of he called them comfort layers, summer, comfort layers, winter. And then that manifests itself with a living space that was tall, harvesting the prevailing winds for dehumidification. The bedroom units suppressed in that lower L that were halfway into the offices. An exterior courtyard, which extends your living space privately. This is a plan of that, early plan. Another unit developed with Trans-Solar was open quite extensively in the vertical planes, but used a chimney effect and brought cool air from the north side up through the south side and out a chimney, and hybridized environmental planning and structural engineering into a social structure. These are concrete T's that balance the building structurally, but also produce the comfort layers. So it works itself out like this as an early sketch, if you want to see that. So this is the north side, the south side. The bedrooms were in the middle, the chimney effect and a solarium, harvesting the heat in the winter and shedding it in the summer, but completely developed simultaneously as structure and as environment and as a social program and a smaller unit. And these are early sketches. So it ends up in the final plan. This is 14 acres built around an existing school and church, courtyard houses, floor-through units, finally supportive housing, and then a whole hybridization. As an economic model, it's not necessarily an easy sell because the housing is economically hybridized with offices and is economically hybridized with the government building. And when you put it all together, it is environmentally and economically mutually supportive. But of course, if one of those ceases to work in the future, they are physically and literally tied together, which most development avoids. Matthias and Transolar describing the energy savings. This is the single-family house. This is our house. And then finally you get to this level. This is cooling system improvements. And this is extreme behavior modification. Transolar does not believe that in the future we will ever be as comfortable as we are now. We simply can't afford it. And we don't have enough technology to make it possible either. So that we will eventually get those numbers down, but we will also have to learn how to be different in terms of what we expect. So Matthias was proposing extreme behavior modification. A little diagram early on. It looks like architecture school right there, I'd say. And then how it manifests itself in the city. Those are the single-family houses in our development. There's the church. The courtyard houses are tight together, but they open to the sky. They have their own little yard and courtyard. You enter into a skywalk and you move through the maze down the outdoor walkway to your unit. You can eventually come across and drop down into the retail space and move into the offices and a set of courtyards that link it all together. So daylighting was taken care of through that. The structural system is an adaptation of a Snelson tensegrity structure. I'll show you a detail of that. So it's a weaving cable with using small wide flanges in compression and sometimes in tension that produces a stability as a diaphragm cable. The buildings, the little houses are made of fiber reinforced concrete. Their weight manifest in the tension structure produces the ballast that produces the tension and stabilizes that whole structure as a plane. We developed that, and Zachary Costor at Arupa, one of my partners on many projects, did some engineering to help us make sure it could work. This is Don Draper falling backwards out of his job. This is or some accidental death, I'm sorry to say, but the camera is sort of falling on its back. But you can see the blue section there. The wide flanges are coming together in these junctions. The cables are weaving through in a tensegrity fashion, and the cables are, of course, always in tension, but sometimes the wide flanges are in tension, sometimes they're in compression. The buildings drop into that as a net, and you can see the bedroom here dropping. This is the pedestrian level. The bedroom then drops into the office and then rises back up. The housing is a thermal blanket for the offices during the day, and at night the housing should harvest the heat from the office. And that is a Tea Party rally aftermath. It is Florida. The gentleman told me I would find the video very easily. That's right there. Got it. And full screen, right? Yeah, perfect. Now, this gets back to the other side of the equation. The teams were given 25 feet of wall space and 20 square feet of model space, some kind of basic denominator. At one point, in a very serious and lofty way, the MoMA really wanted the evidence. They wanted to not see the analysis, wanted to see what you produce architecturally. At one point, Barry Bergdahl, who was the chief curator, he published that Excel diagram in the catalog. It's the first time an Excel diagram, I think, ever got published by MoMA. And it looked a little like Mondrian, I think. But Barry very much was compelled by that and supportive. But another time, there was a kind of statement said, like, we don't want to see any more Excel diagrams for many of you 5 architects. We want to see architecture. And there was a legitimate frustration that the economic and other forms of activism were not necessarily the same thing as architecture, right? So on the walls, we really showed the evidence, and then we all produced a set of videos in various ways to try to show the research. So this was a video that was about showing the experience of being there. There's another video that I won't show that was on a smaller screen that was showing all of that research. And then finally, the MoMA did interviews with the architects where they got to verbally explain what was going on. But the reception of the show publicly was, I would argue, I think quite rocky. When you deal with the suburbs, you of course are going to hit all sorts of touchy subjects. But that divide between discussing all of the complexity versus the actual result was huge. And I think all the teams suffered from that in the media. Not to mention, I think the MoMA suffered from it in the media, despite bringing people to listen constantly. So, this video was trying to get at the feel of it. So you've gotten off the elevator and you're outside. You go down the Venice-like streets and head towards your unit. That catenary shape is a steel plate that's part of the stiffening diaphragm to make the unit itself a structural member. You see the cables piercing the buildings there. So in a tensegrity structure, that little I-beam right there, that's in compression. But this one is in tension. If you look at a little diagram of how these are produced, the sculptures. So it's acting as a strut when it's in compression. It's acting as a strut as well when it's in tension, but it doesn't look like it. But the houses are individual. The structural system is aggregate. The structural system needs the entire assembly of buildings for it to work. If you take 10 of those houses out of there, the structural system will go into disequilibrium and not work. So you see the dropping down into the courtyard. There's the mayor of Portlandia. If it were Portland, would be sitting there having a meeting at his round table with Kerry and whoever the other guy in Portlandia is. South Florida thunderstorm. There's music to this, but I'm not showing it. And then I always tell people I know nothing about cinema other than what the average architect knows, but we worked very hard on the camera here. The camera is rising, it's following a spline, and it's also then rotating as it's rising, but it's coming up and bringing you as the viewer right through the cable net and then finally above to see the relationship between the building and the neighborhood. And this, you're looking up at an office space that's embedded into the housing. One stair goes to the apartments, one goes to the offices. And you are about to be blinded by the South Florida sun as you come underneath the shade. Look west, get blinded and barely see into the office. There's a strong interest in pushing this thing at some level not to deny the climate and the sun and the light, but to make it possible to get shade from it while you, of course, could see it as well. So. This is the end of the day. As a to go to full screen. So the model. Now, the project definitely had its architectural aspirations. It was influenced by years of work in housing and deeply influenced by the engineering conferences. The engineering worked out with Zachary Kostora, diagrams of the cable net system, a little bit of early finite element analysis, the assembly process for it, and then the team and countless rejected designs that I show one or two of here, including urban design that was rejected as well early on, and little experiments with building housing early on as well. To say that we didn't get to this instantly or that easily at all. There was a lot of failed experiments. This is Temple Terrace, typical house up against the strip mall, of course, not so great. For me, it prompted a return to the unité d'habitation. And once that was all done, travel to France and go down to Marseille. I never knew there was a gas station behind the Unité until today. A woman riding her scooter away from it, the Unité at night. Michael Maltzin down in downtown LA, opposite SciArc, about a 1,000-foot-long buildings. And the way housing is really more today in the world. This is Los Angeles last September, a little two-story apartment complex next to a car wash. We know how much these things are fragmented and how at some level beautiful they are at the same time. That's Berkeley. The foreclosure crisis at some level is people imagine that it's over. It's far from over. In certain places where the courts control foreclosure, there's still a huge amount of foreclosures that were not resolved. But in other places where the courts were not involved in foreclosures or much more of just a legal process where the bank can quickly repossess properties, it also led to a new land rush of aggregating foreclosures into new securities. This was Bloomberg analyzing it, but many others have as well. The Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard estimates that about $30 billion was spent by the top hedge funds acquiring foreclosures. That's not just foreclosures, but those are foreclosures that were bought by Blackstone in yellow or other investors in blue. But they were then re-securitized. The rent roll from these as a new large aggregate form of rental housing was not only taken in as profit, but it's re-securitized as an investment bond for revenue. So you're not just making money renting the house, you're making money on the revenue stream, of course. There is a giant new securitization of this. As many as 15 million houses in the United States went into foreclosure. About 6.7 million completed the foreclosure process. Hedge funds purchased, I think, in the range of about 2.8% of American households. Aside from the crash itself, it was about 350,000 houses were bought by hedge funds and re-aggregated as rental housing. It's about 2.9% of households in this country. So over the course of 60 years, 1.3 million units of hard units of public housing were constructed. 1.3 million. 6.7 million houses evaporated in a financial crisis in about 5 years. The stability of housing, the stability of markets, it doesn't exist. It exists in San Francisco, Manhattan, Santa Monica. So now I'm going to jump just right through this. I won't go into any detail. It's a different lecture. I know Eric Lum. We, aside from knowing each other relatively well years ago, we haven't spent any time around each other in 15 years, I think. But we did have a kind of equally intense curiosity about questions about painting, perception, modern architecture, and in particular Robert Slutsky, the very influential theorist of space with Colin Rowe. My background prior to Houston, Texas, and Rice University was entirely in the realm of architectural history, art history, questions of seeing, questions of perception, and architecture is a kind of visuality machine, within canons of architecture that are well documented and thoroughly debated and controlled. That period of time for me was, of course, it's influential for all of us, what happens to us in school. How it evolves as you come out of school is a whole other story, of course. But for me, the way I'm trying to see into questions of engineering, to see into questions of economics, it's not entirely different. It's about seeing into something and seeing well beyond what is immediately visible. In the middle of all that work on housing, in the middle 2000s, a client came to me, Philip Gefter and Richard Press, standing in a house I designed for them, came to me in the kind of classical storybook tale of architectural practice. We know your work. We want to build your dream. And I went, really? That had happened to me a few times, but not gotten completed. But they, in fact, did know the work and had seen it published and been to all the exhibitions. Philip Gefter was, at the time, the photo editor of page 1 of the New York Times. He did not come out of journalism. He came out of fine art at Pratt, and he was controlling the image of the New York Times. Any image on the front page of the New York Times went through Philip's curatorial job. Richard Press was producing small films in terms of duration and expense, I would assume, but films that were being highly regarded artistically and aesthetically. It was a set of clients that had an intense knowledge of architectural history and aesthetics of visuality. Philip had, at that time, reviewed the Joanne Verberg show at the Museum of Modern Art and had written this amazing review in the New York Times about time within a still image. And they were basically the type of client that knows you, challenges you, and knows history, and had purchased 12 acres of land in upstate New York. That's their house in the middle of a forest. They owned 12 acres of that forest. And we proceeded to design a house that was a kind of optic vision machine. This was in construction as we were beginning work on the glass conference at Columbia, and it was when we were getting to know Kazuyo Sejima and her team. And part of what made that conference so palpable was living through trying to produce a glass building myself, but also understanding the difference between how this was engineered versus Toledo and feeling the difference, how it was really affecting everything in the building. We had very sophisticated engineers, Robert Silman and Nat Oppenheimer on structural, Andy Seabor, he was the mechanical engineer of the Getty, Altieri Seabor Weber, doing that building. He took on this little house. The contractor had built a house for Stephen Hall right before this. And we went through this series of projects where they challenged me to take work that I had done in previous iterations and reinvent it with some criticism and insight from the clients. And it turned into a courtyard house that, and I'm not going to go into any detail today because the lecture is too long, but a courtyard house that was an ocular machine of sorts, but that was also based on the time at using very, very large sheets of glass. These were 9-foot tall by 14-foot wide IGUs. It was made by a company called Rochester Glass. They were able to produce the largest single lights of glass in the country at the time. Maybe somebody else can now. We were pushing for the flatness of the glass, the planarity of the glass, the transparency of the glass, but using the glass as a quasi-diaphragm to stiffen the skeletal structure of the building. So the glazing was framed, the glazing is discrete from the structural frame, but it's held by structural silicone, 5/8 inch structural silicone joints around the perimeter, enough for everything to flex without breaking a light, but nonetheless bringing it all tight into the structural frame and super flush. So there's no public housing here. There's no city economy. And all of those questions that were deep in my psyche at that point in time, I switched back to being an architect and with a client who was just amazing and a builder who was amazing. This is all largely built on site by Mitchell Rabideau. The steel was delivered to the site. He built a shed and he hand cut the steel on the site, welded it on the site, sandblasted it, cleaned it with solvent, prime it, paint it. Things that would normally happen in a shop, this all happened right there locally. And so you can see the sandblasted steel here at the bottom and the can of solvent. There's a piece of tube steel cut. And then these 9-foot by 14-foot double plates of 3/8 inch glass in an IGU, about 1,500 pounds each, 9.9 pounds per square foot. All of that kind of going in, of course, in this case with a sophisticated machine, and then structural silicone, just zipping the whole building up. Doing this in the middle of a forest, moving the glass from the road to the site took about an hour per piece of glass because it had to go so slow. And this is the guy doing the silicone work. That's the GC watching him, but they're now in there. And construction. But this is a whole other lecture, but the scale of the glass is such that the peripheral vision fades away and starts to bend around you. And ideally, it then pushes you topologically into the landscape. Column detail. And then finally, the Richard Barnes photographs. Richard used to live here. Of the final building. I feel like Sejima. People say it looks like Philip Johnson. It looks like Mies. Philip Johnson's glass house, the glass is 3.3 pounds per square foot. It's single lights of glass. It's not tempered. This is 3/8 inch glass. Philip Johnson's is 1/4. This is double. It's got low E coating and it's tempered. It weighs 9.9 pounds per square foot. And the perimeter of this building is immensely heavy, and all of the glass is suspended 4.5 inches outboard of the building envelope. So on the one facade it's suspended, on the other it's just tucked in. So the effect is the glazing on the right side of the photograph there, you're seeing it stepped a couple inches past the structural wide flange of the building. On the other side, this wide flange. Typical kind of architectural obsession, but the glazing is moving within the envelope of the building very delicately. The effect in some places is that you end up seeing the edge of the glass more than through the glass, and in that case, the glass becomes a kind of object rather than a plane, which that photograph was intended to capture. The ceiling in the bedrooms is black. Courtyard. And then 2 clients. The clients both have offices in the house. They asked to be able to be, on one hand, close together, but simultaneously as far apart as possible. So the U-shape, which spouses working at home, but the U-shape, the J-shape quality of the house both allows the planar flattening of the space, but then to visit somebody, you have to take about a 200-foot-long walk. And so I love this picture. This is Philip Gefter working. He's getting visited by Richard. There's Philip working. Richard's on the other side of the house, and then nobody's working. When you build a building like this, the columns are bolted into the foundation, but the slab is not in place yet. So that entire building is up on little anchor bolts in space and moving like crazy until you put the slab in. You can see right here. While this took a tremendously long time to build because the contractor was really pretty much a 2-person show and very, very talented, but not a large scale. We were frequently looking at the building rather than being in it. And there was a kind of joke running along the project was the 2 clients had careers that were obsessed with looking. pictures, art, and that it gave them the patience to constantly be on the outside witnessing it as much as being in it. Eventually, they moved in and have been there for about 6 or 7 years now, and that's the way it looks at this point in time. I'm going to stop there without explaining something, but those ideas are now getting played out in a small building in Shanghai for a small art gallery on the Huangpu River in a consortium of buildings that includes Young Ho Chang, Mark Lee, Wang Shu, I forget the other 10, but it's 10 individual galleries being built along the river and that are, in some sense, a derivative of this project. So in closing, the point I just want to make tonight is that this engineering at a very high level is out there. It's in buildings by Herzog and Sana and Rem and others. The argument I'm trying to make tonight is that we could find ways in which that comes down and moves through a whole different strata of development. But to do that, somebody is going to have to start working at a very high level of making the economic jumps and the arguments for how that's possible. We ended up very close with a geographer named Eric Belsky. Eric was until recently the director of the Joint Center for Housing at Harvard, at the GSD and the Kennedy School. He's now at the Federal Reserve in a very high job. But Eric ended up a great friend of the project, arguing that he believes that we are moving to a place where a huge economic transformation will, in fact, not only take place, but it will take place because all of the old asset classes are no longer that attractive as investments. So banks, do not want to hold $7.5 trillion worth of mortgages against bad assets. They will if they have to, and of course, plenty of people could care less. But that history of what housing was is relatively short in the history of settlements. And the 30-year mortgage is relatively recent, and the run-up in debt is relatively recent. So I would just like to think that, we as architects are at a moment when, depending on how we phrase the debate and enter it, we can be more influential, I think, than ever. So thank you very much for listening. I know you have your own work to do. Thanks. Thank you. It's great to give a lecture when you feel like the person who invited you understands you. Thank you, Eric. Yeah. And to be part of a school that seems to be so full of energy. I saw the model. Yes. The comedy at Columbia was, after a lecture like that, the joke was, now let's go find the bad wine. Okay. But I'm perfectly happy to take questions.
I think I'm very excited about your lecture, and I think I'm very impressed that you're, and I actually believe in this, because today I had a discussion with a student that said to me, I want to quit architecture. Oh. And I feel like this pretty much every day. So I really believe in the holistic vision of an architect, or the way of thinking, and I think you embody that totally. I mean, the way you look at structure, at building, but also the way you look at society, and at the different levels that make architecture, and architecture as a cultural practice, almost the culture of humanity, and the culture of architecture. So I said to the student, it doesn't matter if you leave architecture or not. You're going to do whatever you're going to do in the way you're going to do it. So, but I think architecture enables you to think in this holistic way. And can you talk about, I think, especially to our students, how you manage to do that? Because I think it's very inspiring what you do and how you do it.
I love that conversation. I'm going to quit architecture. Yeah, I have. The last student I had quit architecture. He founded Pinterest. Evan Sharp. He took the housing studio at Columbia, and he said, what if I take a year off? Can I come back? And I said, yeah. Where are you going? He goes, Silicon Valley. And I said, oh, you'll never be back. And I ran into him in a restaurant the other night, and I said, well, okay. That's an amazing question, because right before I went to graduate school in architecture, I remember having a long talk with my father, who I was and am close to, we all close to our parents. And I said, I'm thinking about going to law school. And he was like, what? Because I was an undergraduate in architecture, and I had that feeling of, as much as I love architecture, I felt like it couldn't touch all of these problems. And I had worked as an architect, and I was very frustrated by it. same time, I felt intuitively that if I quit, I was copping out. And I thought, well, that's not a good reason to stay either, because you're psyching yourself out of quitting. But the part that was attractive about law was the conceptualization of law as spatial. But I think in the end, staying, there was a drive to try to reconcile that question of wanting to quit but not quitting, but then trying to figure out how to expand the province of what you do. But, you know, to be very blunt, my practice is like this. You know, sometimes I have 3 projects and then they evaporate, and then I have nothing for 6 months, and then I have 1 project, an amazing one like Philip Gefter and Richard Press. Teaching, of course, balances that back out. I think if you look at the history, I don't want to be general about this, I think people know this far better than I do. From Aldo Rossi or Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown, so many important figures of the last 30 and 40 years were trying to reconceptualize our relationship to commodity markets and to society. So it's in the, you know, it's Michael Hayes is the history theory, you know, is, you know, Frederick Jameson's influence on everybody. I mean, so many architects have tried to reconceptualize how do we relate to markets. There was a comedy of sorts that when I was a student, I'll tell you the story. When I was a student, we talked about you had a client. So here's your project, and your client is a bank, or your client's a gym, or your client's a medical center. And then your client is a user. Your client will use the building. Or your client is the owner. They own the building, and they get to call the shots, and you have to convince them otherwise because they own the building and you don't. You have liability for 10 years, all these things. The other side of it, though, was at some point it started being called your client is a subject. And from critical theory, you know, subject as in Michel Foucault talking about a subject. Your client is a political being, a social being, a gendered being, all of the. But, you know, that phase shift, which occurred during my life in education, enabled a complete opening up of what practice is. So, you know, the building isn't you as architect and the user who's going to live there. The building is also the Federal Reserve that's securitizing the mortgage. You know, it's all of that. And I think if you go, you know, schools of architecture today behave that way. So I would say I appreciate the comment, but I think we're doing that. What did it for me that's fun, I'm the son of an engineer. My father was an electronics engineer and 26 satellites in space, X-ray mapping the sun. They located the proof of the first quasar. He was the engineer and then the physicist, the team of them. But I was raised in that kind of world of that what's happening underneath the surface. You know, and that's our, you know, what's happening molecularly, what's happening chemically, what's happening financially. And you can look at that in very cynical ways, politically and socially, if you want to, but you can also forget about the commentary about it, like the article about Obama being a cheap way to get access to a future president at that time. Or you can look at the stare and the magazine and the ink on the paper and what's the advertising revenue at New York Magazine? Will they just be gone in 6 months? You can go into all of it. I think that's what architects do. Architects, they take everything apart all day long, right? My cousin once said to me, she goes, "Isn't that exhausting?" Like, you know, that you go to a restaurant and you're analyzing the table, the tablecloth, the lighting, you're looking at the windows, you're thinking about how the hinges work, the door was off center, you know, you didn't even eat yet. Yeah. So he goes, "How can you live like that?" Try Xanax, you can mellow out. Yeah, okay.
I have a question.
Hey, Karen. Hi.
Hi, Michael. You were arriving at Columbia, I think, just as I was leaving.
Yeah.
And I've been following your publications. And I found them so grounding, especially for an institution like Columbia, where the audience, so I did the 3-year program, and by my 3rd year, I was so cynical because nothing we did left the walls. You know, like it seemed like the audience that our work was relevant to was so small.
Right.
And that we were talking about our work using all these language and vocabulary jargon that only make sense amongst us.
Yeah.
And with your publications and the conferences, you immediately broadened. It was very grounding in that sense that now we're dealing with gravity, materiality, other industries, people with other expertise. And then I find it fascinating the way that you try to connect that point of view to your work with the public housing, and how, especially with the MoMA, how you're trying to re-engage the public discourse.
Yes.
And I wonder, so my question is, what are some frustrations and epiphanies or discoveries you made in trying to engage the public in a true discourse, where I feel like, so my experience, the disconnect is so great,
Yes.
So unless the clients are like, you're doing clients that call you up, for the most part, we just don't even speak the same language.
Yeah.
So how do you find common ground to widen the audience?
Oh, that's an amazing question, and it comes at a time that's I'm definitely grappling with that. A few pieces of grounding it historically. That work in Houston around housing, it had also, there's so much more to it that I can't show in 10 minutes, but it was definitely a moment of trying to didactically do that. There was a work on theory and history that I had been doing with a book called Slow Space, and with Sanford Quinter and Lars Larup, who was this dean and amazing leader at the school. But that was jumping into the Fifth Ward and the housing questions were an attempt to somehow get the conceptual work to explicitly have to meet the reality, but also to meet a community. And so many people who work in low-income housing do it as a form of social engagement, meaning it's about people really being together and working together, and at some level, how do you talk about complex issues in that regard? That was very immediate compared to the work in New York. There's other projects I didn't show. I think it is that at this point in history, what I'm known for saying among colleagues increasingly these days is we need to find the economist that can talk spatially. Because, and not, I think, you're talking about people at Columbia, Greg Pasquarelli and Shop and Chris Sharples. I mean, so many people that came out of Columbia did end up deeply applied, and I had nothing to do with teaching Greg Pasquarelli. They were out of there before I came in. They were Greg Lynn's students and Evan Douglas's students, et cetera, Bernard Shumi's students. But that I would argue the one thing that goes on with some of these practices today, and Shop is maybe one of them, is I would argue it's more financial than economic, in that it's a strategic use of parametric ideas in architecture linked to parametric ideas in finance, a building, a land deal, and often an amazing result, Barclay Center or something, that would not happen without the architects knowing a lot about finance and et cetera, et cetera. But I think in the housing things that I'm showing is and it's not that this is better than that, but economics as a social science. It's politically, economics is about understanding the distribution of all of the wealth and how does it play itself out for society. A real estate developer is responsible to themselves and their investors. At some level, we hope they're responsible to something else, but the real story is return on investment, ROI. Economics, the Federal Reserve, they're interested in the stability of the country. So I would argue that we're at this moment now where we saw the stability of the country shaken in a way that it had not been shaken since 1929. And as much as it was an economic financial problem of collateralized debt obligations and credit default swaps and derivatives and all sorts of other exotic instruments, it was also, all of that was tied to an old form of development that we have been railing against for a long time without much success. So now I would argue that this door is open to talk, but it will reclose. I think there will be a new instrument produced. I don't know. I often lament hybrid cars because they're going to enable sprawl for longer. A lot of technology. Now you can get 60 miles per gallon, so you can still live 60 miles away from your job because your car has enabled that yet again. I mean, it's fine. That's innovation. That's finance. So I would just argue that I think it's a question of schools and being able to talk about these things in a wider way, and hopefully still stay architectural. To not lose what we're interested in doing, but be able to, and presumably that's what happened with the Bauhaus. But I'm at a threshold. Columbia is an amazing place, but I think maybe, for example, in housing, you need a whole MArch program devoted to housing, so that you could have a year and a half where you could have a class in housing economics, and you could have a class in housing policy, and you could have a theory course in race and identity, and you could get deep into it all, as opposed to within a 12-week class trying to solve everything. The idea, historically, there's been engineering and architecture programs. But I would say the door is open in a new way, yeah. But since I am a Columbia professor and this is on tape, I have to say that that's not entirely true what you depicted. Greg Lynn and all those people were very grounded. Okay, yes. Yes. It's called the Fifth Ward. Yeah, Houston's, there's still a pattern of historic wards prior to the formation of Houston as a city, yes.
So creating that housing to make it affordable was that group of clientele. What I'm learning, because I only recently began to kind of fold the economics into my own work, is to work with the developer that has actually figured out that the baby boomer population, through the whole research analysis of this team that I'm working with, understands that there's a huge commodity of desire for self-sufficient housing for the baby boomer generation that does not want to live in nursing homes, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And then his team has also identified the young grads from school who do want to own their piece of the turf. And New York and San Francisco are key marketplaces because the young graduates can't find and own their own territory because of the market. So this group of thinkers are wanting to align, and this is why I'm working with them. But the first is to actually take the baby boomer generation and identify this housing type that is always in high-density cities because they want to stay in the city because the infrastructure is already there. So I just want to applaud you because the bandwidth of what you're capable of doing is what we're all learning. I mean, we're all mature architects who are teaching here, but I'm also beginning to see that we have to be cross-disciplinary, meaning I now am working really hard at understanding the economics, this parametric thing that you're describing between economy and design, that they're hand in hand, they're woven together.
No, you put it very beautifully. And I taught sophomores for years at Berkeley. I went to school there, then I managed to stay on as a part-time faculty member and originally teach with Stanley Sadowitz, and then independently Antonio Lau was in the back, my old friend, co-teacher. But I say that because the history doesn't matter, but as a sophomore, a 19-year-old designing things, it's probably the highest level of brain power you'll ever have is when you're 19. So the complexity of what we could be doing, I would argue, why not be doing all of this early on? I've had plenty of debates with people, and I understand the counterpoint. But in general, I agree with you fully. But I haven't necessarily, I don't have a sustained way of doing this. It's happening with grants, research projects. Somebody appreciates what I'm doing and gives me another try at it. It's not a practice, like McKinsey, where, somebody is paying you $500 an hour as a consultant to solve their problems. It would be nice, maybe it can be. When Michael Bloomberg became mayor of New York, it was right after 9/11, and the whole reason why it was feasible that he would win the election, part of it was understood that after 9/11, the city needed somebody really understood business. We didn't need another politician per se. But whatever that was, and whether or not that really affected him becoming mayor or not, one of the first things they did, speaking of McKinsey, was they hired, I think it was McKinsey, to do an economic analysis of the city And it was understood as a big lofty analysis. Daniel Doctoroff later on presented it when he stepped down as deputy mayor and went back to private industry, and he gave a lecture at our school and explained all of these documents that were previously private. But it was a little 50-page document projecting where future jobs would be in New York, what kind of jobs, where they would be. I mean, it was the kind of thing plenty of architects/urban designers produce a version of. But they used that as a roadmap to rezone everything. It was, I was, to be blunt, shocked at how rudimentary it was. I'd always heard about this legendary study that they used, but I thought it was incredibly rudimentary, but nonetheless, it wasn't, I didn't think it was mistaken or flawed, it was just rudimentary. But a mayor who has a Bloomberg's degree was in engineering as an undergraduate and then Harvard MBA. You know, the argument about him was he was so data-driven and so engineering-driven that as a mayor, he looked at the whole city as a kind of instrument and just adjusted it. And, but I say that in regard to what you're saying because anybody who lived in that period of New York, I think, saw all of that. And some people were appalled by it, some people loved it, but it was absolutely a management of a city by somebody who understood it physically, economically, in comprehensive ways. Yeah. We're there, aren't? Hasn't everything been fully mapped already? I mean, the idea was, you know, in the the sky got mapped, the oceans got mapped, you know, the country got gridded. I mean, all of these kind of old forms of geometric and navigational control over territory on planet Earth. But today, that mapping is so comprehensive and so much of it is private, right? Whether it's Facebook or Google or Apple or whoever, there is a new comprehensive control of space out there, and our participation in it, especially those of you, sitting here in the epicenter of some of that. It used to be Wall Street controlled space. I think now it's Silicon Valley, right?
Well,
I think that's enough, right? I answer questions in 10 minutes instead of 2. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. We'll continue the conversation.
I'll come back. Thank you.